evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the 2024-2025 end of year pension process webinar, where we'll be focusing on the Type 2 self-assessment form and solo work. So my name is Debbie Roberts and I work in the PCSE communications team, and I will be helping facilitate this evening. Okay, so just to let you know who we've got on the call this evening. So we have Katrina Veneris, who's our PCSE Senior Stakeholder Relationship Manager. And then you've got myself and my colleague Kat supporting from the PCSE Communications team. Okay, just having a quick look at the agenda then before we make a start. So we're going to be having a look at different types of solo work, and then we'll have a look at the annual solo form. We'll then jump into how to calculate the correct T rate and have a quick look at the annualisation calculator. We'll then have a look at under or overpayments, and then Katrina will kindly do a system demo of the Type 2 form in PCSE Online, and then we will end on your questions. Okay, so looking at types of solo work, so I'm now going to hand you over to Katrina, who's kindly going to go through these next slides with you.
Thank you, Debbie. Good evening, everyone. Okay, so as Debbie said, we're going to concentrate on solo work. We held a webinar on Type 2 24-25 forms a few weeks ago when the forms were first released, and we spent a lot of time going through the ins and outs of why people need to do a Type 2 form and dealt with a lot of the relatively straightforward aspects in relation to GPs who have salaried roles in practices, so their income is recorded on their PCSE Online employee contribution statement as monthly salary. But we know there are a lot of GPs that do solo work, and it can be a little bit of a confusing area because the processes are slightly different for the different categories of solo work. So we thought we would have this session this evening to concentrate in on some of those aspects. We'll get through some of the content, but hopefully leave enough time for questions for people that have got anything specific that they want to hear more about. So types of solo, starting with out of hours providers. So that might be out of hours provider, extended access services, these kind of services. And you'll see when you go to your PCSE Online employee contribution statement that when you go to the select practices drop down, and you can filter on the different organisations that you have worked for, then we've just highlighted there an example of an out of hours provider that this GP works for. So we've selected financial year 24-25, we've got solo earnings, and we've just highlighted the provider example, and you can see they've got an ODS code beginning with NK. The ODS codes can be quite varied for out of hours providers, but you can tell by the long description in the name who the provider is. So that's our first example. Out of hours providers generally will pension GPs who work for them through the solo route. There are one or two other organisations who may not be specifically out of hours providers, but they may have agreement with NHS pensions that their GPs have to be pensioned through the practitioner route, and therefore they use the solo route. So these providers, you'll be able to tell when you go to your employee contribution statement what the organisation actually is, and you'll see the solo contributions that have come through for you. Now, the solo monthly process for out of hours providers in 24-25 is or was and started that year, where the out of hours providers on a monthly basis send across a spreadsheet of data to the ICB that commissions their service, and they also send the payment for all of the pension contributions for the GPs who have worked for them across to the ICB, and the ICB now does that reconciliation of the contributions data that's been sent across and the payment that's been received. There may be one or two GPs that work for a particular out-of-hours organisation, or in some cases there are, many multiples of 10s, 50, 60 GPs working for the same organisation. So the out-of-hours provider checks they receive the correct amount. That's then paid over to NHS pensions, so that pays the money direct to NHS pensions. It no longer goes via NHS England. And the data, the ICB, they log into PCSE Online and they upload that monthly spreadsheet. So if you're a GP who works for an out-of-hours provider, then, depending on how quickly they do that, it will be into the following month, and sometimes it can be a number of weeks later. You will then see, if you go to your PCSE Online employee contribution statement, you'll gradually see April, then May, then June, if you have been working for them every month. That will update during the pension year. So by the time it gets to submitting your Type 2 form, if we're now submitting or completing 24-25, when you go to your employee contribution statement, for all of the months that you have worked for that provider, you should see your income, your monthly income as solo earnings, and your employer-employee contributions, etc., for each of the months. And then you'll see the total for the year. So that's how that data gets into the PCSE system now. It's the ICB that uploads it after they've reconciled the data they've received from the out-of-hours provider with the payment the out-of-hours provider has made. And when they upload the data to say these are all of the GP contributions for the month, then that payment is made directly over to NHS pensions. So that's how the out-of-hours process works. If we move on to the next type of solo work, please, Debbie, then we've got ICB clinical leads or board members. So we can see in our select practices drop down here, we've got an example of an ICB. So we've got NHS Lancashire and South Cumbria, just as an example. The ICB ODS codes tend to all be 3 characters beginning with a Q. So if a GP has worked as an ICB clinical leader board member on a contract for service, then this is also pensioned through the practitioner route, and that's also through the solo route. Now, for these GPs, then it's a similar process, except the ICB has the source data themselves, so not waiting for it from anybody else. It comes from their own kind of payroll system. So they've got all of the data for the pension contributions for the GPs who worked for them as clinical leads or board members. They upload that to PCSE Online and they make payment of the pension contributions direct to NHS pensions. So again, from a GP point of view, if they have been pensioned as practitioner because they've got a contract for service, then they will see on a monthly basis, slightly retrospectively, that their PCSE Online employee contribution statement updates with the data from their monthly pensionable pay, employee-employer contributions, etc. And once again, when it gets to the end of the pension year, then the totals and all of the income and contributions should be there, and they most certainly should be there by the time it comes to the kind of back end of the year where we are now, and people are starting to look at doing their 24-25 Type 2 forms. Now, some ICB clinical leads and board members are or have a contract of service, and the contract of service individuals are pensioned, or the NHS pensions rules are they are pensioned as officers in the scheme, so their contributions don't flow through the PCSE system. They're going to be paid direct, and the data goes direct to NHS pensions with the other members of staff from the ICB's contributions essentially. But if it's a contract for service, then that's when the data flows through their PCSE Online record as a result of the ICB uploading that on a monthly basis, and the pension contributions already paid across by the ICB to NHS pensions. And then there's a third type of solo work from an NHS pensions perspective, then GP appraisers, so GPs who work as appraisers for one of the NHS England regions, then They also, if they have other salaried roles or partners, then their work as appraiser work is also pensioned as solo, again, just under the NHS pension rules. We don't make the rules, just have to apply them. Now, this data comes into PCSE slightly differently. The ICBs aren't involved here at all. This data is coming from NHS England, and the data essentially comes from the central RMS system that appraisal activity is recorded on. And every month, PCSE receives a very large spreadsheet of data which contains the details of the income and contributions for all of the GP solo appraisers for the whole of England, and then that's uploaded by PCSE to the PCSE system. And once that has been uploaded, then GP appraisers who've been pensioned through the solo route will be able to see on a month-by-month basis that their employee contribution statement gradually throughout the year is updating with, each month's pensionable income and contributions. NHS England regions pay the actual contributions direct over to NHS pensions, but the data comes in to PCSE for PCSE to upload to the system, so it gets added to the GP's PCSE online record. So for all three types, then by the time we get to this point, and you're starting to complete your type 2 form, then when you look when you log into PCSE online and you bring up your employee contribution statement and you filter on solo work, then your total earnings for your total income, your total employer contributions, your total employee contributions, they should be exactly as you're expecting them to be. And that's based on exactly what's being deducted from you during the year. So let's just move on to the next slide. Now, at the end of the year, so just after the end of March, I guess, somewhere into April, May, June kind of time, then someone from the administration side of each of these organisations gets the job of compiling or completing an annual solo form for all of the GPs who've been pensioned through that solo route. So regardless of whether that's an out-of-hours provider, whether it's an ICB clinical leader board member, or whether it's a GP appraiser who's worked for a region, someone in the administration teams of each of those organisations needs to create an annual solo form. NHS pensions still require those forms to be completed by organisations that have GPs working under roles where they're pensioned through the solo route. So as a GP who has worked in a solo position, you should also receive, after the end of each pension year, an annual solo form that you should have a copy of. You should be asked to check it and sign it, and then you should have a copy of that. And it's advisable for you to, when you've received that annual solo form, it's advisable for you to go to the Contact Us form on the PCSE website and to select a GP pensions submission and to select solo and to submit that annual solo form. When you do that, from your own details are recorded in that submission, then if there are any questions when you've submitted your type 2 form, if there's any differences between the figures that we're expecting to see on your form, etc., then that annual solo form is the first go-to place for PCSE. And if you've submitted it yourself with your own details, then it's very straightforward for us to locate that. In years gone by, then you've had single administrators who may be submitting 50, 100 plus forms, maybe more, and they're not immediately recorded against each of the GPs, so there's more of a kind of trying to interrogate the system to find those forms. It's very straightforward if the GP themselves has submitted them, so it will just speed things up for everybody. So when you receive your annual solo form, then it's a good idea, and we have discussed with all of the providers that they should be recommending to GPs who work for them to submit the annual solo forms to PCSE, so there is that record. But essentially, if you think about what we've just been through for the three different types of solo work and how that month-on-month process works throughout the pension year, then when it comes to that annual solo form being completed, if you then, and you've received that and you're checking it, if you go to your PCSE online employee contribution statement, the totals that you see for pensionable pay, so box C. In this example, you've got employee contributions in box E, so that's your selected tier rate times your pensionable pay, and then you've got your employer contributions down in box J. Those amounts on your annual solo form should match what you can see on your PCSE Online employee contribution statement, and if they don't, then most certainly submit a copy of your annual solo form, but also speak to your provider, whether it was a region that you worked for as an appraiser or whether it was out of hours provider or an ICB, because something has gone wrong somewhere with the data. And when you think about the different routes of the data now getting into the PCSE system, then it all comes kind of from a source point, and it's good to deal with any queries and get any of that resolved before it even comes to the point where you're working on your type 2 form like you will be now. So in future years, then it just lets you get a little bit ahead of the game. There's no reason why the data wouldn't match if all of the data has been uploaded, but occasionally somebody has missed something, or it's an upload's failed and they haven't realised, things like that. They're simple to sort out when we get to the bottom of what's caused it. But if the ICB or the out of hours provider or the region is given the heads up to say, my employee contribution statement on PCSE Online doesn't look like it matches my annual solo form, then it lets that all get sorted out in good time before you have to get to anywhere near close to the type 2 submission deadline. So that's our annual solo forms. Just moving on to tier rates. And I just want to touch on this because we do cover it and did cover it quite a lot in some of the other sessions. So it's just a quick check for anybody who hasn't joined the previous sessions. Each year has its own tier rate table. When you log into PCSE Online and you go to the type 2 form, you'll see that you can click on it and see the tier rates, but there's also a published set of tier rates on the NHS Pensions website every year. And what I would say is 24-25 starts to make it a little bit more streamlined. So if you think back, if you've been a pension scheme member for a number of years, you'll know that a few years back then there was probably almost double the options of tier rates, and it just made it a little bit more complex. But now you've got less options. You've got a band or a salary band, and wherever the total pensionable pay for the year falls, whichever band it falls in, then that's the tier rate that you need to pay contributions at. Now, it might be that when you get to the end of year form, so you get to your type 2 form, it could very well be that when you calculate your total pensionable pay, especially for GPs who've got a portfolio of different roles, it could very well be that when you calculate your total pensionable pay, what it actually was for the year, it could be that you've been paying your contributions, or at least some of them, at a higher tier rate than you needed to be, or a lower tier rate than you needed to be. And we'll get on to talking about the solo, what impact that has for solo if we've got either a shortfall to sort out or there's been an overpayment. Okay, so the next slide, if we move on to that, I just want to touch on annualisation. Now, people who do solo work, GPs who do solo work, then often, BMA colleagues have pointed this out a number of times, that they often have a continuous contract, so it doesn't actually matter. So if they are continuously pensionable, it's not really very good grammar, but throughout the year, then annualisation doesn't apply. So, if you're not sure about that, then you check your contract with your employer. PCSE don't have that information and aren't privy to that information, but you will be able to find that information. If you've got a continuous contract, then you will not have to annualise, even if you don't have solo contributions or pensionable contributions or pensionable income every month. But obviously it might be a situation where somebody is becoming or being in the practitioner pension scheme for the first time. Maybe they were a registrar up until partway through the year, and the first kind of fully qualified job, if you like, is partway through the year and it's a solo role. So it is possible that that's a scenario, and if that is the scenario, then you have to annualise that income, because NHS pensions rules require that that's the case. If you haven't been pensionable for the full year. So the screenshot just now just shows us where on the NHS Pensions website we can find the annualisation calculator. So there's a section in the member hub for practitioner members, and when we go to that, then one of the top options, it's a very busy page with a lot of different options on it, but near the top we have the GP tiered contributions and annualisation calculator, and there's a specific annualisation calculator for each pension year because the tier rates, or at least the bandings, are generally different in each year. So if we go to the next slide, we've got an example, just a very simple example that I've quickly filled out earlier on, so I'm hoping it's correct, but it's 24-25 calculator that is now available on the NHS Pensions website. It wasn't when we did the webinar a few weeks ago, but it has been for the last couple of weeks or so. So the calculator is available. So if anybody does need to annualise, then you can now go ahead and use it. We select the income type. So if it is solo work, it's classed as type 2. The start date and the end date of the employment. So this example, the GP has been 1st of April 24 to 30th of September 24. And they've gone off to do different things. They're no longer a practitioner member in the scheme after that, but they have to fill out a type 2 form for the period that they were a practitioner member. So their pensionable pay that they earned for the period that they did work in that role was 27,000. So that's what we enter under pensionable pay, and we just click calculate. It's a very simple example. It's only got one row, and it annualises the pay. Tells us it's 53,852, and it tells us the tier rates that applies to that. The table is there in the calculator as well, but the calculator tells us, and if we've got multiple rows to add to that, then we simply click add row, complete the row, add row, complete the next row till we're finished, click calculate, and then you will have your tier rates and your annualised pay. And that tier rate is the percentage that you then need to have paid or pay, if it hasn't been correct so far, your employee contributions for that year. So again, that takes us back to the conversation that there are a number of reasons why what you've paid when you come to look to do your type 2 form may or may not be the correct employee contributions, because you may or may not have paid at the correct tier rate when you get to this point. So that's a very quick fly through annualisation and getting the tier rate correct if you do need to apply it. But like I said, BMA colleagues always point out that a lot of people who have or who do solo work, they have a continuous contract to avoid having to annulise. So let's go to the next slide then, please. So just want to touch on under and over payments then, focusing in on the solo work. And I'm sure people will have questions about this stuff, but I thought it would be helpful to go through some of the content. We'll have a little bit of a quick look at the system, but then we can get into the questions that people have. So just like how the data gets into the PCSE system these days, and that we went through earlier for all of the different types of solo work, then if we do end up in the situation where contributions, pension contributions have been overpaid for a solo role or underpaid, then the process and what needs to happen is a little bit different. So out of hours work then, starting with that, and this is what PCSE are doing, is applying the kind of rules and processes that NHS pensions are instructing. So, you know, you might feel it's quite bureaucratic, it's quite, you know, that there's quite a bit of to and fro in some instances, but it really just is the process that needs to be applied. So we try and do it as efficiently as possible, and that's why I was saying earlier on about the annual solo forms. You know, that is the declaration by both the provider and the GP that this is the correct amount of pensionable pay, correct amount of contributions. So you can see why that really is kind of, you know, the version of the truth. And even if there have been any issues when somebody's been uploading any data or anything like that from the ICB, etc., then, you know, having the annual solo form, we can start pinpointing that. But if you've overpaid because you've been paying, or you've had your contributions deducted at what turns out to be too high a tier rate than, or a higher tier rate than you needed to be on, then for out of hours work, the rule is that PCSE need to process a refund to the provider. So the refunds go through the NHS England payment portal. Now they're paid by the third party that deals with all of that. They're paid by BACS. So part of the process PCSE need to do now is confirm the correct provider and bank account details, etc. And that refund request is raised and it goes to the provider. The provider then needs to sort out whether you, as a GP, have over or underpaid them in terms of the contributions that they've deducted and make any necessary arrangements directly with yourself. If the solo out of hours contributions have been underpaid, so the contributions have been collected at a tier rate that's lower than it turns out they should have been based on your total pensionable pay, etc., then PCSE need to contact the out of hours provider to request payment, and the out of hours provider currently make those payments to NHS England's bank account. PCSE then check that, reconcile that off, add it to the GP's record. The amount gets paid to NHS pensions, and you know that's the solo reconciled. That may change in the future. That may be something else that ICBs get involved in, but at the moment those payments still come from the solo provider, the out of hours provider, to the NHS England account. There's a little note there that says about providers that no longer have the out of hours contract. That makes things really quite difficult when it comes to reconciling over or underpaid pension contributions, and PCSE need to. Fortunately, there are not many providers where that has happened, but there are some, and it does occur from time to time. So PCSE need to liaise with NHS pensions if that's the case. If we get onto ICB clinical leads or board members, so overpayments there, slightly different for both overpayments and underpayments. Really, PCSE have to notify the ICB that the GP has had too much in the way of employee contributions deducted, so is due a refund, and it's down to the ICB to arrange that refund and liaise with the GP. And conversely, if there's been an underpayment, then PCSE need to advise the ICB again. This is for their clinical leads and board members. If we have a shortfall situation, then the ICB needs to sort that out with the GP and just confirm to PCSE so that we make sure that the GP's record is then updated with the correct contributions. So, you know, like I said earlier, sometimes that causes a little bit of a time lag because we need to wait for that confirmation in that instance. And then the third and last type of solo work when it comes to overpayments and underpayments, then we've got the GPs who work as appraisers for NHS England. Now, again, slightly different there. So the agreement in that scenario is that if the GP has ended up having too much in the way of employee contributions deducted for their solo appraisal work, then PCSE are permitted to raise a refund request to be paid direct to the GP. So again, that process has changed recently in that previously those refunds were paid by cheque, but it's now a BACS refund. So there's a process and there's a screen on PCSE online now where the GP can log the bank account details for the refund to be paid to. So PCSE would notify that there is a refund due and advise the GP to complete the bank details, and then when those details are completed or entered on screen, then the PCSE agent can raise that refund request to NHS England, and that makes its way through the various systems and the GP will receive the refund direct. And then the opposite really, if there's an underpayment, then PCSE contact the GP to advise and provide them information as to how to make the payment and what BACS reference to use, etc. And then when that payment is received in, that allows their solo record to be reconciled and their PCSE online record to be brought up to date. Now, only when all of that's done for each of the scenarios, and like we said, the process is slightly different depending on that type of solo work, then it's only after the solo work has been reconciled, any shortfalls or overpayments have been dealt with, or the ICB's confirmed that they're dealing with them with their clinical leads or board members, it's only after that that PCSE agents can then finalise the Type 2 form on the PCSE system and then get to your NHS pensions record to update it with the correct contributions for the pensionable pay that you had for the year. And it's worth mentioning that one so that you understand that the NHS pension record can't be updated until that's occurred, but also for GPs who have that kind of mixed portfolio of roles, and they may also have a role where their salaries at a practice, if there has been an over or an underpayment by the practice that also needs to be sorted out, that's sorted out by an automated adjustment when the Type 2 form is finally submitted through the PCSE system as fully approved, and that can only happen after any of the solo bits are sorted, and also if you have locum work too, for those with a really varied portfolio. So again, it's just thinking about that timeline. If the practice is expecting that they're going to have either a deduction or a refund, depending on the scenario, for the contributions they've paid for the GP, then that will happen after that Type 2 form is fully reconciled, and these solo bits need to be sorted out first. So just setting expectations around that really, and I think we might be pretty much at the end of the slide. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm just going to show you a little bit of system navigation in the test environment. As Debbie mentioned at the beginning, all of the data in the test environment is fictitious. It's not quite real life situations, but it will give you a feel for it. I appreciate there'll be people with different levels of previous exposure to the PCSE system. So we're just going to have a little bit of system navigation to check. Okay, so this GP in this test environment has a salaried role at practice and has done some solo work. Again, as I say, just fictitious test data. When you log into PCSE online, depending on the overall roles that you have, then you will have and see different tiles. The test environment is also notoriously slow, so it takes a little while to click around. But in a real life situation, a Type 2 GP would have a performer list tile and a GP pensions and payments tile. So this test example does have both of the tiles. So if we go to the pensions tile, then there'll be a number of different options. So let's just have a look at the employee contribution statement. Ignore all of the numbers and things that are the identifiers. But if we look, because that will, when you log in, that will populate with your GMC number, with your pension scheme membership number, etc. So what we're really looking to do is to isolate in the drop-down filter the pension year that we want to look at. So we'll be looking at 24-25, and we can just click search, and that will give us all of the contributions that are in the system for me as the logged in GP for the year 24-25. And you can see that we've got the totals at the bottom there. So this GP's got all of their monthly salaried income, and they also have this one solo line as well. So if we filter on the solo earnings, then, and we click search, then you can see that you can isolate each of your income types. You can do the same for monthly salary. You can look at them separately, and we recommend you do this before you go to the Type 2 screen, and you see that in the Select Practices drop down. So in this example, there's a practice, that would be the monthly salary role, and then there's an out of hours provider as well. So if we go back to just the solo, change the filter, click search, then we can see that 1 month on the contribution, the income and the contributions. So when I go to the Type 2 form, what we'd be expecting to see is that our GP has row 2 completed for the salaried role and row 3 for the solo role. So let's just go see how this test data is working. So we go to self-assessment Type 2. The listing button here is really important. Unless this is your first year as a type 2 or a pensionable GP through the practitioner scheme, or you haven't completed any forms for previous years, then you would go to click on the listing screen, and that will list all of the forms that we've processed previously for you, whether you've submitted them on PCSE online or whether you've submitted older years on or via the Contact Us form, on what we would call the paper form. Then all of your approved forms will show in the listing screen. So if I just click on that here, not actually sure what this test GP's got, but we'll soon find out. So we've got a draft here for 24-25, which is good that I've spotted that, because I want to delete it because we want to start afresh. So that's when we've been checking things in the test environment earlier on. So if we go back to self-assessment, so just as a reminder, from the main pensions area, we're going to self-assessment type 2 and then just click self-assessment, and your details will populate. You would then select the financial year, so 24-25. If when I went to select in the drop down it said something like already initiated stroke completed, that's what would have happened if I hadn't have deleted that draft when we were in the listing screen there. So all you need to do, if you see that, a message that says already completed stroke initiated, just click on the listing screen button and that will bring up all of the forms, and there will be the draft version. So even if you've only got as far as bringing up the details previously and then you've logged out again, it may be that you've had a draft created. So don't panic if this says already completed and you think, well, I haven't completed it, I haven't submitted it. Just go to the listing screen and you will find the form that you can continue. So what you'll see is we've got the practice, because this GP has worked at a practice and they also have their solo work. We're just going to say that they don't have any approved leave and they don't have any added years, just to show how the functionality works. So we're going to save and next, and it's now a very straightforward type 2 form, because as you'll see on the navigation panel down the left hand side, since 2022 there's only been one pension scheme. So again in the old years there was the different pension schemes, and you had 22-23 year that had the split year, so you had 2 6-month periods. It now becomes, to be fair, from 23-24 the type 2 form becomes a lot more straightforward. So what we see here then, I'm going to look at the salaried role in a second, but we're going to just home in on the solo work. So the solo role that we've got, then we've got the total pensionable pay that's pulled through, and the contributions in box 3B, that's the contributions that PCSE have on the system. So that's what's been submitted by the provider. Like I say, fictitious data might or might not be a sensible amount. That's what's been submitted by the provider as the data during the pension year 24-25. When we take into account our other incomes, so this GP only has the salaried role on top, so they have 35,000 on the salaried role, so that takes the total pensionable pay in row 6 to 37,900, which for 24-25 puts them in the 9.8% bracket. So if we select at the top 9.8%, because that's the correct tier rate that I should be on or should have been on for the year, then what we then need to see is the GP needs to go and check month 12 pay slip, etc., to get the figures for the amount they actually had deducted by the practice. So we've now got that figure too. So let's just say they had £2,000, just as an example, deducted by the practice. Then that indicates in box 2B that there is an underpayment by the GP. So as the GP, if you have had a salaried role, in box 2A you're recording the contributions that you've actually had deducted through payroll for that role, for your employee contributions. So whatever that figure is, then that's in your month or on your month 12 pay slip, etc., then that's the figure that you record there, and the system calculates for you whether you've had a shortfall or an a shortfall or an overpayment, or whether it's exactly right. Now, I didn't do this earlier, but if we had, so I'll just have to check the calculator. Sorry. So if we had 35,000, so if at the practice I was paying exactly the correct tier rate, then if I check my payslip, that would say that I paid 3,430, if I've done that right, yeah, in employee contributions. So if the practice had been deducting me all year at 9.8%, that's what my month 12 payslip would say. It's £3,430 that I've paid. So there would be no difference. There's no shortfall for me to pay, or I haven't overpaid. So that zero is telling me, as far as a GP, as far as I'm concerned, I'm fine. Box 2C, what that does is that pulls through the figure for the figure that PCSE have deducted from the practice based on the estimate they submitted, and that's what's then calculated when the Type 2 form is fully submitted on PCSE after any other reconciliation is sorted out, because then the practice then has an adjustment applied to make sure that they have paid the total correct contributions for the year. So in this instance, they've deducted the correct amount from me to the GP. I've got that evidence from my payslip, so I've put this figure in here. But PCSE's records say that because it was a lower estimate the practice submitted, then that only the 1,820 has been deducted so far. So an adjustment will be applied to the practice for the difference between the 1,820 and the 3,430 that actually is due for the year. The practice will see that adjustment in the contractual statement, the monthly contractual statement, but as a GP, I leave that to PCSE in the practice because that's been sorted out by PCSE. But that's why that figure 2C is there. It just pulls it through. It's obviously pulling it through from the PCSE system, and it's not doing anything with your calculation here, but NHS Pensions wanted it on there as a, so that it's that there's a record of it there, or the option to have a record of it. But from your point of view, if it's a salaried role, then it's the actual contributions that you've had deducted that you put in box 2A, and then the calculation, the system does the calculation based on the tier rate that you have then selected. Okay, so that's how that part works. When it comes to solo, so if we just take a step back, solo, we've got the income that we've earned for the solo work, and it's populating, so it works differently in row 3 for solo work than it does for practice roles. So for solo, it's going to populate box 3A with the contributions that PCSE have received, or received confirmation of, at least they've received the data from the solo provider. The solo provider has said this GP's had £2,900 income and we've collected £188.50 from them. Like I say, it's test data, but what the system is calculating is saying, okay, 2,900 times the 9.8% tier rate that the GP has selected is giving us £284.20. The provider's actually paid £188.50, so they've clearly been deducting at a lower tier rate, or at least paying over to pensions at a lower tier rate. So there's a £95.70 shortfall. Now this example, it was an out of hours provider, wasn't it? So in that scenario, PCSE would go to the out of hours provider and say, for Dr. X, for 24-25, because they should have actually been on 9.8%, and you've only paid £188.50, but you should have paid £284.20, then you need to pay a shortfall of £95.70. When the out of hours provider makes that shortfall payment, this GP's record is then adjusted by PCSE to say we've now got another £95.70. So in total, the ease that we would have for the GP would be the £284.20. So we'd have the total that was the correct total for the 9.8%, and that's when the GP's record can be finalised, PCSE online, Type 2 form is fully approved, and then assuming the GP doesn't have any missing years, then their NHS pensions record is updated with the correct contributions for all of that. So that gives us an example where we've got a GP who had a practice role, but they've had some solo work, and obviously for some GPs then they may only have solo work, So there may be nothing at all in row 2, but if they've worked for an out of hours provider, they might also work as a regional appraiser, so they could have row 3 and row 4 for their 2 different solo roles, and PCSE go through and check that reconciliation for both of the roles. Contact the different organisations separately depending on the type of solo, following what we said earlier about under and overpayments, and then ultimately, once that's all done and dealt with, then the GP's record can be brought up to date. So there's probably another test example that I've got, Debbie, but I'm going to pause there because I think we've gone on and went through quite a lot there really, and probably just start looking at what questions that we've got. Right, so first question that we have is, if the drop-down contribution menu doesn't work, does that imply my annual solo form hasn't been received? So I think the scenario that we've got here, let me just see if I can go back to one of these test examples. When you go to 24-25, and even without any filters, you don't have any contributions showing here. So you've done solo work for the year, but you don't have any contributions showing here. Now, it doesn't mean that an annual solo form hasn't been submitted. What it does mean is that we haven't received any month-on-month solo data for you. So I don't know whether you started for the organisation that you've worked for from the April, or whether it was later on that year, and whether they've actually already tried to upload data. So depending on whether you're working for an out of hours provider, etc. So the first thing is to, yes, get your annual solo form from them, but also to contact the organisation you worked for to say, I'm looking at my employee contribution statement on PCSE Online, and PCSE don't have any contributions data for this role. Have you uploaded it? Has there been a problem with that? And then get them to unpick that. Okay, thank you. So next question we have is around a GP who has done some locum work, but also out of hours on a sessional basis. If you're not employed by the out of hours provider. Now, if you have a contract for service, then you need to check with the out of hours provider again if they have been pensioning you through the solo route. And then if they have been pensioning you through the solo route, then you would have to complete a Type 2 form. But again, you should see in your employee contribution statement, you should see solo contributions, but do go and check with the provider, because as I mentioned earlier on, we have seen scenarios where an administrator at a provider or at an ICB has thought that they've managed to upload some data either on behalf of an out of hours provider or for GPs that work for them, and there's been something in that data that's not been that's had some missing fields or something like that that's made it not actually be able to be accepted by the system, and they've gone on to do something else and haven't realised that that's what's happened. So there are a number of scenarios where that can happen. So go back to the provider. So then we have a question that says, it seems that earning 2 months, August and September, this is 2023, but that's fine, we can talk about 23-24 as well, worth about 20,000, have not been included but seems to be added in the next year on PCSE. So it seems the employer has submitted the figures but matched to the wrong year. So I've called PCSE a few times. So I've seen that happen before, and like the person who's raised the query has suggested that maybe it's been entered retrospectively or uploaded retrospectively, but it hasn't been recorded in the data upload that it's actually for prior months from the previous year. So this has been the year 23-24. You should have a case reference, so for your Type 2 form that you've submitted. So it is correct to contact the PCSE and raise a case and a query, but I would also go to your employer and ask them to check from their end, and then they should be able to also contact PCSE just to speed up getting that sorted out. It can be quite difficult to get to the bottom of why these things have, what the root cause of it being incorrect is, but if you have your annual solo form for the 23-24 and 24-25 years now, then, providing both of them side by side to say that's what 23-24 should have looked like, this is what 24-25 should have looked like, then the data can be rectified, but there does need to be the evidence submitted for what the correct data is. But if you have an annual solo form for 23-24 and an annual solo form for 24-25, submit both of those with that explanation, and PCSE should be able to get that resolved for you. Does NMS locum income need to be included in the annualisation calculator? So, Simon, you have to forgive my ignorance, but I'm not sure I know what NMS is. Apologies. I've got most of the acronyms for GP pensions, but not being a GP, I've not got them all. So if you can let me know, essentially, if you have pensioned your locum work by submitting locum A and B forms and paying your pension contributions, then it needs to be included. If you are a locum only GP, so if you haven't done any other practitioner work, you haven't done any solo work and you didn't have a salaried role at practice, then locum only GPs don't complete type 2 forms. From 22-23 onwards, they do need to annualise their income to get or annualise their pensionable pay to get the correct tier rate, but they don't complete a type 2 form. But if you're a type 2 GP with other roles and you've also done some locum work, then if your other roles mean that you had continuous pensionable status as a practitioner, so for instance you worked at a practice all year or you had that kind of solo contract, you don't have to complete the annualisation calculator anyway. So it does depend in your scenario. Okay, so I've got a question here. I'm an NHS England appraiser, no salary partner, no solo work. How do I add my pensions contributions to PCSE? So if you don't have any solo work and you have opted to pension your income, you should, I believe, be completing locum A and B forms, Kirsty. So if you speak to the region that you're an appraiser for, if you don't have a salaried partner and no solo work either, if you are purely doing locum work, then your appraisal work would also be locum, so that you would complete locum A forms, be approved by the region, excuse me, and then you complete locum B forms and submit your contributions every month. And if you are a locum only GP, as I was saying to the other query, then you don't complete a type 2 form. I'd see that you've said I also do chambers locum work, which is maybe solo. Again, if it's locum work, then it would be pensioned by locum A and B forms if the organisation you work for has an employing authority status that allows you to pension GP work. I hope that helps. So then we have a question that just says I'm due a refund for a type 2 form submitted in February 24. Obviously next one's June 25. I don't know if you mean February 25, maybe 26. Is it normal to take 10 months to? So it's definitely not normal to take 10 months to process the form. Depending on the type of refund it is that you're due, then there has been some delays with refunds, but it's difficult to tell, Joanna, whether it's have you been a GP appraiser and you're due a direct refund, or have you worked for an out of hours provider? If you want to add to your comments and let me know what your scenario is a little bit more then, and potentially get the case reference in, we can get that escalated for you. If it's taken as long as that, it shouldn't have done. Are salaried roles with federations counted as solo work? Now, I was wondering when we'd get into some quite tricky territory, to be honest. So I hate to give the answer, it depends, but it does. So it depends on the sorts of contracts that GPs are employed by it depends on the sorts of contracts that the federations are delivering, what the rules are then in relation to how the GP's income can be pensioned. So there are some contracts that are now where federations are delivering contracts with ours roles, and there's still ongoing discussions between NHS England, policy and finance, etc., about the process for pensioning some of that. So when that's all agreed and it's rolled out to PCSE, then there'll be communications and people will, there'll be a process to do any retrospective stuff that needs to be done. So it very much depends. And what I always say to any pension scheme members when they've got queries about should my role be getting pensioned as this or through the practitioner scheme, or should it be, solo, etc., then speak to whoever's responsible for pensions at the organisation you work for. Depending on the organisation, that can sometimes be outsourced to a payroll provider or whatever, but so, it can take a little bit of navigating to get to the right person, but there will be somebody in the organisation who's responsible for pensions, and it's their responsibility to make sure that everybody who works for them understands how income is being pensioned for that work. And as I say, it is unfortunately can get into a little bit of complexity, but they will have all of that information. Okay, so let's see another example here. So we've got August 24-25, works for a solo provider, and it says long-term locum for 3 months and then remaining 9 months as employed salary GP with the same out of hours provider. They've given me 2 solo forms. Do I need to fill 2 separate rows on the Type 2 form? So what I would say about that query is look at your employee contribution statement, go to PCSE online to the Type 2 form as well, and see how that's pulling through. If the provider, most likely, and I say most likely, will have one single ODS code, one single identifier in the PCSE system. So when they've been submitting contributions data, I'd be expecting that they would all of the data, all of the solo would show under one code. So if that's the case, then there is no issue with you completing all of that in one row in the Type 2 form, but submit your 2 annual solo forms, but your 2 part, solo forms for part years as well. Make sure PCSE have got that, because again, it's another slightly unusual scenario that could end up in query territory if it's not understood properly, because it is quite unusual. Read this question. It's the contributions drop down on the Type 2 form. Okay, right, thank you. So we went back to a scenario earlier on where I thought the query was that there were no contributions showing on the employee contribution statement. So I think the query is actually the employee contribution statement does have solo earnings. I think that's what we're saying, but there isn't contributions drop down on the Type 2 form. So there is a box to add employer code. I'll try and show you that in a moment. And if you go to the employee contributions statement and see what ODS code we've got for the provider that you did the solo work for, when you go to the Type 2 form, then you should be able to add that ODS code in and then move on to complete the Type 2 form. So then we have another question. I'm glad that this question's come up from Angela, actually, because I haven't really mentioned officer roles. It would normally have come up before now in a webinar session. So I touched on it a little bit by kind of labelling the fact that the Type 2 form you must only include practitioner roles on the Type 2 form. But the question from Angela is, how do we calculate the tier rate if one job is out of hours as a GP? So I'm assuming that's a solo role, Angela, from what you've said. And the other is a salaried non-GP role. So you might want to, again, put a bit more colour on your example, but if it's an academic role a role for a trust. So it's a pensionable role under the NHS pension scheme, but it's being pensioned as officer. So that means that the organisation is paying the pension contributions direct to NHS pensions and sending your data across every month with that. So officer work, so roles that are pensioned through the officer scheme under the NHS pension rules and not the practitioner scheme, the income is not included when you calculate the tier rate, and you don't include the income on your Type 2 form. So I had a conversation with the GP just last week actually saying, well, that really, really doesn't seem fair. You know, I'm expecting to include all of that. So there is on the NHS Pensions website, there is a guide that goes into a lot of detail about how the GP pension scheme works, and it does touch on this, that some people do have officer roles and not all of the roles are practitioner, and it's very, very clear that the tier rate has to be calculated based on just the practitioner work. So PCSE are applying the scheme rules as you can understand. But to answer your question, Angela, the tier rate would be based just on your out of hours solo work and not your other role, if it's an officer role. Okay. The contribution menu doesn't work, then does it imply the annual solo form hasn't been received? As I was saying, it doesn't necessarily imply that, but if it's the contribution, it's the monthly data that comes in that populates the employee contribution statement, and then the data from the employee contribution statement is what pulls through to the Type 2 form when we've selected the organisation or entered the organisation code in the Type 2 form. So if the solo data is not there on the employee contribution statement, then the provider hasn't, either they haven't submitted it to the ICB or the ICB's had a problem with the upload and may not realise that they have. So go back to the provider initially and talk to them and ask them to check. The annual solo form would be your evidence that this is what I did actually have deducted from me, but PCSE need the data from source to get it into your record. So from the provider. Okay, so this is back to a scenario we were talking about earlier, so just to give a little bit more background on it. So we've got the GP who does locum work and out of hours on a sessional basis as well. I'm not employed by the out of hours provider. Do I need to complete the Type 2 work? So not if you don't have any solo work. So that goes back to checking with them. If everything's going through as locum, then that's all of the contributions are then treated as locum and you don't complete a Type 2 form. So yes, speciality doctor, thank you, Angela. So yes, that will be an officer role. So that clears that one up for you. And I'm sure there'll be other people who've got similar sorts of scenarios. Just a question about pensionable pay, and it does come up quite a lot. Is that the same as gross pay? So your payslip should have your total pensionable pay on the payslip. We've actually been looking to see if we can work with a provider to get an anonymised example of a payslip, because we do get these questions a lot. Again, it's not an area that PCSE would have any kind of specialist background knowledge on. However, because it's the populated Type 2 forms that we have to deal with, but it is a question that came up quite a few times on that previous webinar, so we are trying to get an example payslip to help with that. Yeah, so out of hours, as we said, if it's been pensioned as solo, then that would be Type 2. So we've got a slightly different scenario now. So Fiona says, I left being a GP partner and became a salaried GP June 24-25. I also do GP appraisals. Do the salaried months need annualising, or is it just the total I was paid my salaried plus my solo work on the Type 2 form? Okay, so I just need to make sure I've understood the scenario. If you were a GP partner for part of 24-25 and you became salaried, which is I think what you're saying, your tier rate is calculated from all your practitioner income. So if that was kind of continuous, then it's just your total income, so you're not annualising to get the tier rate. The Type 2 form has row 1, which is where you enter the figures for type 1 work, any type 1 work a GP did. So if they were a partner for part of the year, it's just to calculate the correct tier rate. So it's just so that your total pensionable income, total practitioner pensionable income is calculated for the year, so that you can then look up the correct tier rate. So your type 2 form, so if you have to complete a type 1 form and a type 2 form, then really if you've been solo alongside the type 1 element and then solo alongside the type 2 element, you'd have that split across the certificate. It's obviously a bit of a tricky year to sort out and move on from, but you do need to deal with the period you were type 1 on a type 1 form and then the period you were type 2 on a type 2 form. I hope that makes some sense. I was just going to perhaps get you to bring up the last slide, Debbie. I think we just did a couple of things to recap on. So we haven't mentioned, it would be a bit remiss to go through the whole thing and not mention the deadline, which I'm sure people who've joined the call will be aware of. So deadline's 28th of February for your 24-25 forms. Definitely encourage you to have a look at PCSE online. Once you get used to navigating that, you'll find it really easy to submit your form on PCSE online. And just a bit about that timetable really. So there is something in the region of about 35,000 GP pension scheme members who all need to submit their forms by the end of February, and PCSE have a window until early June to process all of the forms submitted by the end of February to meet the NHS pensions data refresh cut-off. That does mean that processing is staggered, so we have a really big team working on the submissions, but as you can imagine, because that's the processing window that NHS pensions sets, then for some GPs it means that they do wait a number of weeks and sometimes even months before they actually get a response back from us saying we've now reviewed your form. So don't worry about that. Appreciate it would be really helpful if you could get an immediate response, but with there being 35,000 or so and the team working through them, then that can take some time. But all I would say is the sooner that you submit it to us, the better. Normally we do tend to get about almost half of them in the last couple of weeks of February, last 2 to 3 weeks, so getting early really is the plea. Just again going back to that question about total pensionable pay for your solo work or practice work, it would be your month 12 pay slip. As we said, if you do or have done some locum work, then that would be the total of all your locum B forms. If you do have salaried role in the practice, then one of the things that people get a bit stuck on is, especially if it's a role that's changed relatively recently or in the 24-25 year or maybe just before it, then sometimes people's performer records haven't been kept up to date, and that's the first part of the process that actually gets them attached to a practice for pension purposes. So that again, just check your performer record if you've got any issues not seeing contributions for any practice roles that would be monthly salary that you would be expecting. Lots of supporting videos and guidance on the PCSE website, not just for pensions but for employment changes and things from a performer record side of things. Pensionable pay and contributions on the annual solo form, we highlighted earlier on, they should match your PCSE online employee contribution statement. So if they don't, the earlier you speak to your employer, the better to flag that, rather than when it's kind of knee deep in the time for processing the type 2 form. So get in touch with them and get a copy of your annual solo form into PCSE so that it is at hand when we come to processing the type 2 form. And if you do end up in the situation that does need to be annualised, etc., then I've mentioned already there's a lot of detailed information in relation to that and in relation to all of the different NHS pensions rules on the NHS Pensions, so NHS BSA website. But thank you very much, Debbie. I'll just hand back to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Katrina, and thank you for going through all that information and being able to answer all those questions as well. So hopefully everybody found that beneficial. I'd just like to say thank you for attending and yeah, good evening. Thank you.